This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. I'm Bob Duchesne, and you're listening to the 1 hour on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket that is unlike any other hour on this radio station. Who else would tell you that owls and herons don't mix?
So what is happening is herons will arrive at their colony and find that a great horned owl has taken up residence of one of the nests. Now it's up to the herons to decide if they want to continue nesting at that colony and risk being that close to a pretty big predator, or if they should move on and find another spot.
Buckle your seatbelt. Other stations bring you shows you can listen to inside your pickup. This station brings you shows that happen inside a pickup. Today, we're going off to investigate a disappearance. Great blue herons are vanishing. Now, these are about the biggest birds in the state. You've seen them all over the lakes and streams and shores, but you're not seeing as many now as you used to, and we don't know why. Since bad news for herons could be bad news for us, the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife is taking a look at this potential early warning system. Something is apparently out of whack out there. So as the show begins in a moment, I'll be in the front seat with wildlife biologist Danielle Doria to go take a look at a particular nesting colony. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Old Town Trading Post, Dysarts, Hammond Lumber, Napa Auto Parts, Van Raymond Outfitters, O'Neill's Power Equipment, and EBS. Now, if you pardon all the noise from the engine and the bad road, let's get to it. All right, well, let me set the scene. I'm in an I-W pickup truck. Danielle is driving. We're heading to Duchesne to examine a heron nest. And this is part of the Heron Observation Network, or Heron for short.
Right.
This is our second time talking about the great blue herons and the fact they've been declining. But this is my first chance to go into the field with you and take a look for myself. Tell me, what is the problem?
Well, we don't really know what's causing the problem and really not sure what the problem is. We do know that our coastal colonies, which are the ones that are on our islands off the coast of Maine, have declined since the 80s, down about 66% in the number of nesting pairs. And so by seeing that, we decided to start looking at the whole state as far as the population goes to see if that same decline is going on statewide. So since 2009, we've been trying to figure out where all the inland sites are and then monitoring them through the use of volunteers as well as staff.
Was the question whether they were declining everywhere, or is it a question of are they moving inland off the coast for some unknown reason?
Well, it's kind of both. So we definitely would like to know if they're declining inland as well. And one of the thoughts is maybe that some of our coastal pairs have moved inland, and our inland population is really doing just fine.
Is there speculation on why they would move inland or why they have declined to the coast? Food supply, increase in bald eagles? What?
Yeah, a little bit of all of that. We're not sure, but on many of the islands where we used to have very large colonies, there's no longer herons there, but there are nesting eagles there. Somewhat coincidental, but we do know that eagles will go after both adults and fledglings and attack them and kill them and eat them. So they are a predator of great blue herons. And one of the thoughts is that maybe bald eagles are preying upon great blue herons more often than they used to because of a problem with the food supply, with our fishery resources, or something going on within the oceans around those coastal colonies.
So the eagles aren't able to eat its natural prey, which is, it's a fish eagle. And so they're switching diets?
They could be, yeah. I mean, they are opportunistic predators, but, you know, they are also primarily fish eaters in certain situations, so...
Well, it's ticklish because the eagles, there's been some question about the eagles going out to Seal Island off Rockland and eating great cormorants out there.
Yeah, so we've seen a lot of conflicts with eagles as the eagle population has recovered and really been burgeoning. I mean, they've been thriving, especially along some areas on the coast. We're seeing more conflicts with other species, so it's a challenge to manage it all.
But eagles and herons have coexisted for a long time, and an eagle is going to have its hands full trying to take down a heron because they've got this big long stiletto for a bill. How good are they at defending themselves from an eagle if they are facing it off?
the few times I've witnessed interactions, sometimes I've seen them in the air, an eagle chasing a heron, and while that heron is in the air, they're not as agile as the eagles are, so that heron looks very vulnerable, because you think of a heron when they're flying, they're very graceful, they've got these long wings and slow wing beats, and an eagle can maneuver pretty well, even though it is a large bird. So once the herons have gotten on the ground, they've been a little safer, or in a wetland area, they seem a little safer. And then in other situations, I've seen eagles go after young in the nest, and the adults do seem somewhat helpless at that point.
Well, I would think so.
They kind of just, one of their reactions when they get stressed is to kind of scream, and so they just kind of stand there and scream, and I'm sure they would use their bill if they had the opportunity, but they also are going against some really sharp talons that the eagles have too. And the eagles, as I said, are so agile that it's a hard predator to go against.
Well, how long has this survey been going on now?
So we started the Heron Observation Network in 2009. That was our first year. So this is our sixth year?
Mm-hmm. Sixth season anyway.
Yes.
Yeah. So during that time, you must have witnessed some reasons why nests failed. I mean, some of the volunteers must have documented what went wrong. And then there's probably a whole bunch of failures that you can't document the reason.
Right. So some of the reasons, we've definitely had eagle interactions. We've had the thought that goshawks might have gone after the young in nests, as well as possibly great horned owls. We know that they nest near some of the colonies. And we've had observations of raccoons climbing the trees and getting into the nests and going after the young. So there's definitely other predators out there. I guess the big question is there one overwhelming factor that's could be influencing great blue herons and their productivity and ultimately their state population?
Yeah, when you have 2/3 of your colonies disappear along the coast, that's a big change, and there's got to be an explanatory factor beyond just the incidental few extra eagles.
I think it's pretty complicated, and when we start thinking about all the different fish eaters out there on the coast and how they might interact, it gets even more complicated. Other species like ospreys and eagles and herons, they may interact differently depending on where they are on the coast. Some ospreys will nest right next to great blue herons, others will kind of take over heron nests and not allow the herons to nest there. Others will help defend against eagles, if an eagle comes towards a heron colony and an osprey is nearby. So I think it's more complicated than we even realize. But it's interesting, though, trying to tease it apart.
Have you been able to crunch enough data to tease out some beginning hypotheses?
Well, we do. We really want to look at this whole relationship between eagles and ospreys and herons, and how if an osprey is nesting nearby or even within a heron colony, does that offer some sort of predator protection from eagles? Mm-hmm. So that's one thing that we're trying to look at this year with doing some aerial surveys documenting where the osprey nests are and the eagle nests are in relation to colonies, and to see how heron productivity is doing in relation to those distances and proximities.
Because an osprey is going to try to drive off an eagle too.
Yeah, and they seem to be a little more effective at it than herons, at least just by observation.
Well, they're more agile, and they have these long talons themselves that can rake the back of an eagle if he doesn't skedaddle when he's supposed to.
Right, exactly.
Now, owls. I mean, we were talking before I turned this microphone on that some great horned owls will actually take over a nesting site within a colony of great blue herons. You've got at least 2 documented cases going on right now.
Right. So we have, this year alone, we have 2 colonies that we have great horned owls using what were old heron nests from last year. And the thing with owls is they start their breeding season earlier than herons. So they're there way before the herons even migrate back into Maine from the south. So what is happening is herons will arrive at their colony and find that a great horned owl has taken up residence of one of the nests. Now it's up to the herons to decide if they want to continue nesting at that colony and risk being that close to a pretty big predator, or if they should move on and find another spot. But at these 2 sites this year, it seems that the herons have decided to see see if they can hold their own and produce young and nest right next to a great horned owl.
Great horned owls nest right out in the open, too, so they must have the same threat from eagles that the other birds would have. Are they able to defend themselves against eagles? Or, because in my opinion, nothing is going to mess with a great horned owl.
Yeah, I don't really know much about interactions between eagles and owls. I would think that it would be a tough fight between the two of them, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So maybe they choose to leave each other alone.
I suspect that's the case because they're really, I've never seen anything in literature indicating there's ever been a battle between the two. I think they must know.
Yeah.
Just for reference sake, we're in the truck going out the airline. We just passed the blueberry fields behind the airline school, and they've got the bees pollinating out there already. As we're heading into a spate of bad weather, I wonder how that'll work.
Yeah. A little bit of rain coming.
If you're just tuning in, I'm in a pickup truck. It's being driven by Danielle Doria, the wildlife biologist at the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, who's in charge of finding out why our biggest bird is rapidly disappearing. We're heading out to the Blueberry Barrens in Blois to check out a great blue heron nesting colony that could become part of the Heron Observation Network. When we return, we'll be about 4 more miles down the road. It's Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Welcome back. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Coming up later in the show, we'll find out why the number of moose permits to be given out this year has been slashed by 25%. But when we left off a few moments ago, I was in an inland fisheries and wildlife truck with biologist Danielle Doria. We're on the way to Blois to scout out a great blue heron nesting colony. If there are herons there, it'll be monitored as part of the Heron Observation Network, a citizen science project that is helping IFW figure out why great blue herons are declining rapidly. That's not happening elsewhere in the country, so something weird is going on here. Volunteers are helping to monitor these nesting colonies, and if this colony has herons, my wife, Sandy, will be the volunteer. She's in the back seat, I'm in the front seat, holding the microphone so that Danielle can drive safely while being pummeled with questions from yours truly. We made this trip on Thursday, May 15th. At this point, I won't reveal the shocking conclusion, but as we come out of the break, I'm afraid you're catching us in a little bit of small talk.
It was really warm every day. And it was so much easier. Like, you just got up and you decided long sleeve or short sleeve, you know.
Well, how many do you have in the closet?
Probably like 6 shirts, I guess. You know, not that many, but...
We're just discussing how many inland fisheries and wildlife jerseys do biologists actually have within the department in the closet that they can put on every day, and I guess the number was about 6. We just made the turn onto South 193, just past the airline diner, heading down toward Du Bois, where we're going to be checking a great blue heron nest as part of the Heron Network project, the Heron Observation Network. Queuing up GPS?
Yep, just so I don't miss my turn.
We're down here all the time. We know where you're going.
Once we hit the Blueberry Barrens, all those little dirt roads look the same.
They do. No signs anywhere. Or actually, the signs are everywhere. They say no trespassing, stay out. So you're looking for volunteers always because there's a lot of nests to be covered out there and not enough people to cover them. What are people expected to do once they become a volunteer?
So once somebody signs up to adopt a colony, really the minimum commitment that I ask of somebody is to go out to the heron colony once during the season. So the season usually starts in the beginning of May, sometimes earlier, depending on where you are in the state, and goes until late May, well, mid-July, I guess, what you would say, in general. So the best time would be sometime around late May or early June, just to make sure you're not missing nesters that failed or ones that got started late.
Because they will try to re-nest if they fail early enough?
Yeah, we've had some sites start up pretty late, and one of the thoughts is that they might have failed at another location and they tried to start up in another, a different wetland or colony site. So we've had colonies where we've had all the nests except one were had young, and then there was still one in incubation. So, you know, there is some variability as far as when they get started, or if they fail, you know, some re-nesting that occurs. Yep.
Now, a lot of these nests happen, obviously, away from where people are. They tend to be in the woods or on the rivers or streams or whatever, away from cities, away from your volunteer base. When you're checking nests along the coast, there's quite a few people there. But when you're going into rural areas in rural Maine, finding volunteers to do those nests must be a little harder.
Yeah, and sometimes our volunteers are the ones who actually told us about the colonies. So they might be people who noticed it on their own property, or a favorite place that they snowmobile during the winter. They go by a wetland that had an old stick nest, and then they check it out in the summer, and lo and behold, they find a heron. So it's spread by word of mouth primarily. Besides those who actually have them on their property of their own.
Yeah. Well, I see we've hit a stretch of 193 that really needs to be resurfaced. Thought pothole season was over.
Yeah.
Frost heaves should have been gone by now.
Right. Things are a little slower out here.
I guess so. So how did this particular colony come to your attention when you decided to put it on the network for observation?
Well, this site, when we did an aerial survey in 2009 where we were checking all historic sites and then just looking for things in between, and we found a nest at this site, but we weren't sure at that time because it was early in the season, there was no birds at it, whether it was an osprey or a heron nest. So then we came back later that year, which was 2009, and discovered it was an osprey nest. So I kind of ignored this site for a couple years until one of our warden pilots during the winter had flown over it and noticed, somewhere between 8 and 10 nests in this same flowage. And so last year, we had one of our regional biologists check it, and sure enough, we had a colony of 9 or 10 nests. So within, 4 years or so, we went from one osprey nesting in this wetland to 9 or 10 herons.
Now, I'm not aware of a whole lot of banding going on with great blue herons, so you really can't track where great blue herons are and then moving to, can you?
Yeah, it's pretty challenging, at least in my mind, to band herons, especially the herons that we're interested in are the breeders, and we don't really want to go through the process of trying to capture them at their colonies because that would cause way too much disturbance. So it's pretty complicated to try to actually capture one that you really want to know where it's going.
Well, close to darn impossible because you can't even bait them in.
Yeah, there is some work that's being done with egrets down in like the Carolinas where they're catching them on where they forage, and they put out these little noose nets under the sand in the wading, intertidal area where they're wading and capturing fish, and then they catch them. Their talons get caught in these noose nets, and then they're actually putting satellite transmitters on them. So that's something we've thought about. Maybe down the road sometime we might do something like that. But right now, we don't have any birds banded or marked or anything, so we don't have a lot of information regarding where they go and, either within the state or then, during migration.
The one thing you do have going for you is they are colonial nesters. So you may have an osprey nest that's the same size as a great blue heron nest, and from the air you couldn't tell the difference. But if you see a cluster of them, that can only be great blue heron. Yeah,
definitely. So you wonder when you only see one nest, but when you see a several nests, at one time there was at least great blue herons nesting there. You don't know if they'll be active again that year, but at one time there was.
Yeah. So what's the GPS say? How far are we?
I don't have it on navigation, but yeah.
Rhetorical question then. The answer is about 5 miles.
Give or take.
How does somebody become a volunteer?
So folks can, anybody who's interested can contact me, either, email, phone. We have a Facebook page. We have a blog that our contact information is on. And they let me know pretty much where they live and what areas they're interested in. So somebody might live somewhere but have a camp somewhere else, so they might have a broader area that they might be willing to travel to. And then I just look and see if we have any sites that are in that vicinity, that might make sense for them to be able to monitor.
We'll take a break and get back in a moment with Danielle Doria, the wildlife biologist in charge of figuring out why the numbers of our biggest bird is getting smaller. And we'll also check in with another inland fisheries and wildlife biologist later on in the show and get some bad moose news from Lee Cantor. It's Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. And so far this morning, this entire show has originated from inside a pickup truck. I'm with inland fisheries and wildlife biologist Danielle Doria. She's driving. And by this point, we're in Duchesne and approaching our turn somewhere up there ahead. We're visiting a colony of great blue herons as part of a study to figure out why they're disappearing. They're looking for volunteers to help monitor such colonies. But, as it is elsewhere in Maine, sometimes you can't get there from here.
Some sites, we have to get landowner permission for all the sites too, so sometimes that can be a challenge, or just the access is not ideal. You might have to bushwhack through the woods for
yes.
half a mile, which not all volunteers are really excited to do.
Yeah.
So, there's a couple challenges like that, but most often we can usually find a site that's suitable.
Do you have a lot more sites than you have volunteers?
We do. Well, no, that's probably not true. We have a lot of volunteers who don't have sites, but we still have sites that don't have volunteers. And part of that is the volunteers either aren't in the right place, they don't live in the right area near the sites that need volunteers, or some sites are just not very easily accessed, or the landowners don't want people out there, kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, one of the nice things, too, is you don't have to be a birder. You don't have to be a bird expert or even an amateur to be able to monitor great blue herons, because everybody knows what they are.
Right. They're a very easy bird to identify and become familiar with, and they're large, so they're easy to see even, a lot of times without binoculars. Binoculars are very helpful in this type of work, but sometimes they're not even necessary. So mainly, and the nests, in most cases, they're in snags. We do have sites that are in uplands, in live trees, and those generally aren't even monitored by volunteers because they're too hard to see.
Yeah.
So most of the time, the nests are very easy to see because they're out in the open in snags, and so are the birds.
I visited a colony on Wreck Island in Muscongas Bay years ago. How's that colony doing?
That is still our largest colony in the state. We haven't been out on the ground since probably 2009, but when we were out on the ground then, we had about 120 nests that we counted. And every year when we fly over it, we can only estimate how many are there, but we say it's about 100 to 120, somewhere in that realm.
I actually went in there once with Maine Audubon, and it's like going into a chicken coop. It smelled to high heaven, smelled like chicken guano everywhere, and it was like prehistoric beasts flying around into the nests up there. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, I bet.
Well, this is cool because we're able to drive right by the no trespassing sign. This whole landowner permission thing is really nice.
Now this, I think we just keep going this way.
I'm guessing that's the wetland back there.
Actually, it's not.
It's not?
Well,
Oh.
it's connected, but it's
No.
not. We're way...
Oh.
There's like a forested area in between. There's a historic site in Bog Brook Flowage, which is not too far from here, kind of to the northeast, which is a wildlife management area. And that site, had as many as, I want to say, 40 pairs back in the day, but the last few years there's been no herons there. And in 2009, when we first started looking again, we were down to maybe 10 or 12. But that one, they're totally gone. So some of those birds might have moved over to this site.
Now, eventually, over time, colonies are just going to destroy the habitat that they're nesting in, because all that guano just really kind of kills the trees.
Well, it's interesting. And the ones in the snags, those trees are already dead.
Yeah.
The main thing there is the water levels and how, if the water stays stable, for the most part, those trees will probably stay standing for quite a while, and it might might just be the loss of limbs that might prevent herons from nesting in those trees. But if that those water levels fluctuate a lot more, there'll be more rot on the base of the trees, and then those trees will fall over.
Yeah.
But yeah, even like some of the upland sites, that's been a concern in other areas. We have seen on our coastal islands some of those trees. That could be part of the decline, is that some of the sites, just the trees are not in good enough shape anymore and have blown down. We've had, microbursts might take out a huge patch of the colony, so this is the wetland, and from here it's like directly down this power line as to where the nests are. And you'll see there is osprey nest, up there.
And there's the osprey.
So when you come around, you can see some of the nests. So I'm going to park here this time. Just last time I was down there, but I think this would be less disturbing if we're...
Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine happens everywhere but a studio. We're out of the truck and about to find out if there are herons in the heron nests. But it's apparent from here we've got a problem. There's a great horned owl nest right in the middle of the colony. Give us a couple of minutes to get in position, and we'll be right back on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. I'm in Dubois with Danielle Doria. She's the biologist assigned to figure out why Maine is having a big drop in the population of nesting great blue herons. We're behind the blueberry fields in Dubois, staring into a marsh where there should be 7 to 9 occupied heron nests. Instead, we've got one great horned owl nest, with 2 babies sitting up there and staring at us. That was one of the parent owls that just went into the woods?
Yeah.
Yeah. Great horned owl babies are out in their limbs. I don't know when they'll be able to fly, but they're getting pretty big. Big puffballs, but they can walk out on the limb and stare around them. They're not even really looking at us much. Parent is behind them, looking at us with suspicion but not alarm. It takes a moment for the bad news to kick in. Great blue herons are declining in the state. The Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife had high hopes to be able to study this colony for the summer. The landowner had reported the herons taking up residence a few weeks ago, just at the beginning of nesting season. But a family of great horned owls has taken over, and the decline continues. We spent a few minutes packing up our stuff and working our way back out through the Blueberry Barrens. Once we were back on the main road, I asked Danielle, what did we learn from all this?
Well, we learned that maybe a nesting great horned owl actually is a deterrent to herons to continue nesting at a site. So, from 2 weeks ago when we last were there, the great horned owl was there, but we didn't have any herons, but it was still kind of early.
Yeah.
So we thought, well, maybe the herons just haven't showed up. And then the next day, the landowner said, oh, the herons showed up today, but I haven't talked to him since then. And so I don't know if they stuck around during that time at all, or if they just showed up briefly and saw the owl and
said, whoops,
took off.
Yeah.
So it's a big question mark.
And then you can speculate all you want about how many herons would overcome the fear and nest around an owl anyway.
Right. Because this colony had about 9 pairs, and some of the other colonies that we've seen them successfully nest next to a owl had a little more than that. One of them was maybe 4 or 5 more, so somewhere around 13 pairs. But then the other one that I know of has more like 40 pairs. So there might be some threshold of how many pairs it takes to keep a great horned owl away.
You ever feel you come back from the field having more questions than when you started?
Always. Always.
It might come as a surprise to some folks, but the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife is a national leader in scientific study. Maine has one of the oldest and most intensive long-term study projects on the planet for black bear research. And research in the moose population is so robust that we're now putting radio collars in a bunch of them. That's one way we discovered some bad news hitting the moose herd over the winter. Lee Cantor is the department's moose biologist. Welcome back, Lee.
Thanks, Bob.
What certainly got my attention and probably everybody else's that there's going to be a 25% reduction in moose permits this year.
Right, yeah.
So, why?
Well, it's interesting that I guess I didn't even think about what percent the reduction would be or anything like that. It was simply a matter of taking an initial assessment of our survival project information and applying that to the population of moose in each management district and looking at permit allocations. So what that means in English basically is, you know, for the first time since the 1980s, we've had radio collars on a bunch of moose because we wanted to put together a project that has just started in its first year. It's going to go across multiple years to look at adult female and calf survival, pretty critical elements to know and to be able to quantify. And I think quantify is the important part here. We've known a lot about estimates of mortality in moose over time, but being able to put exact numbers to it is what we're all about. It's called science.
Yeah.
And it's called responsible management. And, you know, lo and behold, it turns out this year we radio called 60 moose. We had 30 adult females, 30 calf moose on the air that we're going to follow for a number of years with GPS collars. And Murphy's Law would have it that it coincided what we saw this last fall, as being a heavier than normal winter tick year. So we count winter ticks on the back of a moose that comes in from the harvest. We calculate that number, and we're trying to associate, you know, how many ticks on the back of a moose in the fall is enough to be a problem over winter for moose. And you can't do that in 1 year. You have to look at that data over numerous years. That's also science. You know, this year was a heavy year, and lo and behold, when those moose were collared, we wound up losing 21 of 30 calves, which is about 70%.
Wow.
Yes.
Is that primarily the ticks, you think, or it's not predation?
No, there's no predation.
Yeah.
No, that's not even on the radar, on the scope of this. You know, look, none of these moose that the whole point here is that we, with GPS collars, we're able to get on those moose immediately within 24 hours, even in the, you know, the nastiest winter conditions. We get on those moose. We had one moose that had been disturbed at all out of 31 mortalities that we've incurred. One moose, and all the rest were just laying there dead. And that's how quickly we get on them. And within 24, 36 hours, nothing's touched them. And so we had these 21 calves lost. And then now we've had 10 adult cows lost, died.
And these are radio collared. I mean, so you know exactly who they are and where they are.
Exactly, absolutely. That's the beauty of this technology. So that, you know, and that was the whole reason for this study was, number one, to quantify rates of survival, and then, if possible, we want to know the cause of mortality. And that's a more sticky issue because anybody who's ever had any experience, and all the people who probably watch CSI on TV might realize that usually there's compounding things that occur with an animal or a person or whomever. It's never just one silver bullet. It's a complicated thing that has to be analyzed both at the site, so kind of a gross inspection to look at what happened where this animal died, but then there's the examining of tissues and analysis of tissues that's done in the laboratory and sent out to various labs, and that's still in the process. But the bottom line here is that, look, when you lose that many calves, which you know, we've seen in various years in different jurisdictions across the country, because winter tick is a tick that has one host, and we ought to talk about this real quick, but winter tick is completely different than deer ticks and dog ticks. And people need to understand that these other ticks have a 2-year life cycle, have 2 hosts at least. The winter tick has one host and lives for 1 year. So it has to get its dirty business done all in 1 year, which means it has to go through 3 phases of its life cycle in 1 year, meaning sucking blood during those 3 phases. And it does it all on one host, and that host is the moose, the poor moose. And when you're going through winter and you got tens of thousands of ticks sucking the blood out of you, that is not a pleasant thing. And not only is it not a pleasant thing, but the smaller the animal, the more likely that it's going to be such a drastic energy drain that in a winter like this, we wind up losing animals.
Well, how do you tell when you've got a dead moose that it died, let's say, of anemia versus starvation in a long, cold winter?
Yeah.
Well, how do you tell the difference? Or brainworm, for that matter.
Right. Well, first of all, when we talk about these calves, all of these animals that we found have died with belly full of food. How do we determine that? We get on the scene. We photograph the animal before we touch it. We do an external examination looking for, does it have any broken limbs? Does it have external wounds? How is it lying on the ground? Is there anything coming out of its mouth, out of its eyes, any discharge? We do the whole external review. After we're done with that, we take that animal apart piece by piece, and we literally dissect that animal on the spot. We take a sample and put it in formalin to preserve it of essentially every major organ in that body. We look for any kind of telltale signs of abnormality. We look for internal parasites. Of course, we do the external parasite exam too, so we're looking at winter tick loads and actually doing a physical count of these winter ticks on this moose. We take blood samples, so we'll do a thorough analysis of blood. And the interesting thing about this project is we have this information at capture. When these moose were captured, we have information on fecals, which gives us parasite loads, and we have blood samples taken at capture when these moose were live. And then when some of them have died a few months later, we do a similar thing, but of course we do the internal inspection.
Well, it's important because moose means a lot of money to the state of Maine. We can't lose that herd.
Oh, absolutely. And, again, this study, it's Murphy's Law. New Hampshire, back in 2002, did their first radio collar work looking at calves as well. And that was a bad winter tick year. And they lost a lot. They lost 80% of their calves that year. Winter tick has been in moose populations for a long, long time. We can date it back at least to the 1930s back here. It's one of those critters that exists on the landscape all across Moose Range. And in some years, not all years, in some years, it can be detrimental. In other years, some moose may succumb to that winter tick load plus internal parasites, et cetera, but every few years, and we don't know what that frequency is. That's what we're trying to learn and predict. That's what's going to make a profound effect on population growth or decline. And nobody knows right now, because of the complex factors as to why a winter tick year is a bad one or a good one. We have a lot of information to guide us, but there's nobody who can predict, next year's going to be terrible, or next year is going to be an easy winter tick year.
My guest is Lee Cantor, Maine's moose biologist at the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. Coming up, other states are having problems, so what have we learned from them? As Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine continues on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. We're back. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Lee Cantor is my guest. He's the state's moose biologist, and we've been getting an earful on how badly the winter ticks have been behaving lately. The state has just started a radio collar program, and unfortunately, it coincides with a very high mortality year. 70% of the radio-collared calves died over the winter. The adults had a hard time, too, and as a result, there will be way fewer permits issued for the next hunting season. Now, we're learning bad news from other states, too, because other states are losing their moose herd.
Well, it's complex. It's more complex than that, and I think the media has portrayed it. They want to set up a real gloom and doom scenario when there are some bad news out there. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But when you talk to folks who are doing the work firsthand, you find some very mixed things out there. Because again, the thing that's difficult about wildlife, I think people need to understand, is that you can't look at wildlife in the context of 1 year. You can't look at a population of animals in 1 year and say, well, this is what's going on. It clearly takes a long term to understand the dynamics of that population. And we're talking decades.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, when you're managing wildlife, you cannot afford to sit back for decades and let whatever happen. You have to make decisions every single year based on the best information and data you have.
Well, some of it really is simple, I suppose, because if you have a high tick count in the fall and then high mortality during the winter, a red flag goes up, and you do have to do something.
Right. It would be nice if that dynamic worked pretty easy. That if you have X number of ticks on the moose, that's going to equal this number of dead moose. I mean, we're not there yet.
Oh, yeah,
right?
Yeah. What is it about winter ticks that they don't just freeze during a long winter and die?
Well, winter ticks, that's the insidious and amazing thing about this tick is that, during the fall, primarily in October, the group of larval ticks, what we call seed ticks because they're, about the size of a rice kernel, they all climb in mass, as one mass, all together, as a team, climb up on a shrub, waiting for a moose to go by. Now, other ticks are what they call searching or questing for a host by themselves. But the winter tick larvae, these young ticks, all go up together, tens of thousands of them, and they're hanging out on these shrubs waiting for a moose to come by. Now, if that fall weather is mild and sunny and nice, they can hang out up there and have a good old time and be patient and wait. If it's really cruddy, rainy, windy, cold weather, then those winter ticks are going to desiccate, dry out, fall off, die, whatever. And so the more mild your fall is, the more time those larval winter ticks have to search out for a host, meaning a moose, and get on a moose, and that's bad.
Mm-hmm.
And then once they're on the moose, well, let the good times roll,
Right.
right? They're on the back of a moose that now has a winter coat. They don't care if it's minus 30 degrees out. They're hunkered down at the base of the hair, at the shaft, at the skin. They have no worry about the weather whatsoever. They hang out there. They take a blood meal. They eventually molt into a nymph, take another blood meal, hang out again until March, April, and where they take a blood meal, molt into adults, breed, and then they fall off the moose. And if they fall off in the snow, hopefully they all die.
Mm-hmm.
We wish for death amongst all these winter ticks. If they fall into a snow-free spring, then they start the cycle all over again.
Well, the
Right.
one thing I guess I can hope for is that the snow stayed in the woods a long time this winter.
Well, we were out there, and we were seeing this, obviously, when we were out there doing necropsies of dead moose. We were traveling through snow. We were counting ticks, and we were seeing, big, fat, plump adult winter ticks falling off in the snow, and that was good. But what that means for this fall, there's going to be some ticks that are going to survive. We hope that most of them die, as we always would, but, again, that's very complex when you get down to the level of that individual moose that died and the number of ticks on it and where it died, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Well, I support dead ticks.
Yes. I think one of the critical elements here is that, we've started a scientific study on looking at survival that's going to go on for a number of years. And it started off with the first year being a very bad year as far as mortality. Not all years are like this, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And again, we started to allude to this, but look at Minnesota. Everybody's heard about Minnesota, okay? 2 winters ago, they started collaring their moose again, and they had a huge amount of their moose die. This year, they collared moose again to get their sample size up. They've had only 2 moose die.
Huh.
Just 2. And both of those were from brainworm.
Oh, wow.
Now, the other thing about Minnesota that I find interesting, and it's not a criticism of them, but they went out last year and had one of their lowest counts of moose in their flights, and this year they had a huge increase in the number of moose they saw in the landscape. And so, again, there's no question that Minnesota has a lot of trouble with their moose. They have wolf predation on moose. They have less of the habitat quality that we have. They have a lot of public lands that don't harvest timber like we do. They have a liver fluke, which is an internal parasite that we do not have. There's a whole change in their habitat that's a problem. They have much, much higher deer densities, which bring along other nasty parasites like brainworm, et cetera, et cetera. They have a whole host of other things that are different than what's happening in Maine. Yet their story is not completely written yet. The media has said, they have a tremendous decline. That's true, but, across the moose range, we're seeing very interesting things happening, from moose in North Dakota declining in the forested habitat, but increasing in their agricultural lands and in the prairie. Moose in the prairie and agricultural lands.
Prairie moose, all right.
Yeah.
Well, great. I appreciate you being back on the show, Lee, and I appreciate the explanation.
All right, Bob.
That's Lee Cantor, and that's the bad news about moose and ticks. Earlier on the show, we had bad news about birds. I promise to make it up to you next week. No bad news at all. It's spring, and if it ever stops raining, the woods are coming alive with forest sounds. Do you know exactly what you're hearing out there? Well, listen in next week. My thanks to the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife for allowing me to tag along on the Heron Safari and borrow even more time from the department's busy biologists. This show might be a good one to share with others, and that's easy enough to do. Go to www.929theticket.com. Click on Bob Duchesne, and the whole episode is on the web for sharing or podcasting. This show is brought to you by Old Town Trading Post, Dysarts, Hammond Lumber, Napa Auto Parts, Van Raymond Outfitters, O'Neill's Power Equipment, and EBS. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine airs every Saturday morning at 9 a.m. on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket.